The rain in Manhattan didn't fall, it sliced. It lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the 54th floor of Pierce Tower, blurring the city's neon grid into bleeding streaks of gold and red. But the chill seeping into my bones had nothing to do with the storm outside. It came from the slightly ajar door of Nathaniel's private study, where the man I loved was calmly dissecting my future. "It's a cleanup strategy, Father. Nothing more." Nathaniel's voice was smooth, the deep, resonant baritone that used to whisper promises against my skin in the dark. Now it was stripped of all warmth, echoing with the ruthless precision of a corporate raider. "He doesn't belong in this world, and Mother is right. Keeping him around is severely damaging our public standing. We transition him out quietly. I'll arrange a generous severance, perhaps set him up with a small gallery somewhere far from New York. Consider it handling a liability." A liability. I stood frozen in the shadowed hallway, my hand resting instinctively on my still, flat stomach. In my pocket, the ultrasound printout I had received just 3 hours ago felt suddenly heavy, like a stone dragging me into the abyss. 2 tiny flickering heartbeats. Twins. I had come here tonight, heart pounding with a fragile, foolish hope, ready to tell him that we were going to be a real family. Instead, I was just a PR crisis to be managed, a stain on the pristine legacy of Pierce Enterprises that needed to be scrubbed clean. For months, I had endured his mother, Eleanor Pierce, looking at me as if I were dirt she had accidentally tracked onto her Persian rugs. I had endured the suffocating silence of this glass and steel cage, all because Nathaniel had held me and told me I was his sanctuary. Liar. A tear broke free, burning a hot trail down my cheek. I reached up and wiped it away savagely. That was the last tear I would ever shed for Nathaniel Pierce. The despair inside me suddenly crystallized, hardening into something cold, sharp, and brilliantly clear. In the world of the Manhattan elite, love wasn't a currency. Power, attention, and data were. They thought I was just a docile, unremarkable Omega who painted watercolors and stayed out of the way. They had completely forgotten the digital footprint I had meticulously hidden away, the systems I understood, and the network algorithms I could manipulate in my sleep. If I was a liability, I was going to be the most expensive one in the history of Pierce Enterprises. Down the hall, the massive double doors of the boardroom were closed. The annual shareholder meeting was in full swing. Eleanor Pierce was in there holding court, surrounded by the most influential investors on the East Coast. Nathaniel was supposed to join them momentarily to present the Q3 projections. I didn't pack a bag. I didn't leave a tear-stained letter on his pillow. Instead, I retreated to the empty administrative alcove and pulled out my tablet. My fingers flew across the screen, a blur of practiced keystrokes. Bypassing the building's internal AV network was pathetically easy. Their security protocols were as archaic as their family traditions. I tapped into the central projection system. I walked quietly down the corridor until I stood just outside the glass walls of the boardroom. Inside, Eleanor was smiling her glacial smile, gesturing toward the 80-inch LED screen that currently displayed a soaring revenue chart. Nathaniel walked in, buttoning his tailored suit jacket, looking every inch the untouchable billionaire heir. I took a deep breath, looked down at my tablet, and pressed enter. Inside the room, the revenue charts abruptly vanished, replaced by a pitch-black screen. A murmur of confusion rippled through the shareholders. Nathaniel frowned, tapping his presentation remote, but the system was locked. Then the sound hit the room. A heavy rhythmic beating echoed through the room. The rapid sound of twin heartbeats filled the state-of-the-art surround sound speakers. It filled the cavernous room steady and undeniable. Nathaniel's head snapped up. The color instantly drained from his face. On the giant screen, the grainy black and white image of my ultrasound appeared 50 feet wide for the entire corporate elite to witness. And then, my voice played. A voice note I had recorded just moments ago in the dark hallway, amplified for maximum devastation. Nathaniel. The recorded voice was perfectly steady, echoing with a chilling calmness. I heard your conversation. I understand now that I am a liability to the Pierce legacy, so I am initiating my own cleanup strategy. I'm leaving. Attached is the only proof that our children ever existed. Consider this my resignation from your life and my severance to your family's reputation. Pandemonium erupted in the boardroom. Investors gasped, whispering frantically. Eleanor Pierce stood up, her face an ugly mask of shock and outrage, screaming at the technicians to cut the feed. But the system was completely encrypted. Through the glass, Nathaniel's storm, gray eyes darted wildly until they found me standing in the shadowed corridor. For a split-second time suspended, I saw the arrogant, untouchable air shatter. He lunged forward, slamming his hands against the glass door, his mouth moving in a desperate shout that I couldn't hear over the chaos. I didn't flinch. I just looked at him one final dead-eyed glance before I turned on my heel and walked toward the private elevator. By the time he burst out of the boardroom, the elevator doors had already sealed shut. The descent to the ground floor felt like a rebirth. I dropped my Platinum Access badge into a trash can in the lobby and stepped out into the freezing Manhattan rain. I flagged down a yellow cab. JFK Airport, I told the driver, my voice steady. International Terminal. As the cab sped away from the towering illuminated monolith of Pierce Tower, I rested both hands on my stomach. The fear was gone, replaced by a ruthless, burning ambition. The Pierces worshipped empires built on old money and cruelty. Fine, I thought, watching the city lights blur into the distance. I will build my own empire, and one day they will beg me for mercy. 4 years is an eternity in the digital age. It is enough time for algorithms to shift, for century-old monopolies to bleed out, and for a runaway Omega with a stolen tablet to build a kingdom of his own. The morning sun of Los Angeles poured through the floor to ceiling windows of Vance Digital's headquarters in Silicon Beach. Below me, the Pacific Ocean glittered like crushed diamonds, a stark contrast to the cold, suffocating rain of Manhattan I had left behind. I stood by the glass, adjusting the cuffs of my bespoke navy suit. I was no longer the quiet, compliant illustrator who painted rabbits and hid in the shadows of the Pierce family estate. I was the anonymous founder and CEO of Vance Digital, a media conglomerate that currently held the attention span of 60% of the global youth demographic. I commanded the data, and in this era, data was God. Behind me, the heavy oak doors of the executive boardroom glided open. My assistant, a sharp-witted beta named Sarah, stepped in her heels, clicking softly against the hardwood. Mr. Vance, the delegation from New York has arrived. They are currently in the security lobby. Thank you, Sarah, I replied, not turning around. Send them up, and remember no names on the preliminary NDAs. Just titles. Understood. She left, and the room descended back into a heavy, expectant silence. For the past year, Pierce Enterprises had been hemorrhaging money. Their traditional media outlets were dying, their advertising revenue was in freefall, and their RPM metrics were an industry joke. They were desperate for a lifeline, desperate to capture the digital native audience that my company controlled with a flick of a switch. They had spent 6 months begging for this acquisition meeting. What they didn't know was that the elusive, ruthless CEO of Vance Digital they were coming to grovel to was the very same liability they had discarded 4 years ago. The elevator chimed. Footsteps approached down the hall. I finally turned away from the window and took my seat at the head of the massive obsidian conference table. I steepled my fingers, my heart beating in a slow, steady rhythm. There was no fear left in me. Leo and Hudson were safely at their elite preschool guarded by private security. I had nothing to lose today and everything to collect. The boardroom doors opened. The Pierce Enterprises legal team filed in first, looking stiff and uncomfortable in the laid-back, sun-drenched atmosphere of LA. And then he walked in. Nathaniel Pierce. The breath caught in my throat for a fraction of a microsecond before I ruthlessly suppressed it. He was still devastatingly handsome, wearing a charcoal suit that hugged his broad shoulders perfectly. But the 4 years had left deep, unmistakable marks on him. The arrogant, untouchable aura of the billionaire heir was gone. Silver threads touched his temples, and his storm gray eyes looked tired, carrying a heavy, haunted emptiness that I had never seen before. He looked like a man who had spent 4 years wandering through a desert searching for a ghost. Nathaniel walked toward the table, unbuttoning his jacket, his gaze fixed on the files in front of him. "Good morning," I said. My voice was calm, projecting across the quiet room. Nathaniel froze. The files slipped from his fingers, scattering across the polished obsidian table with a sharp sound. His head snapped up. For a moment, the entire world seemed to stop spinning. His gray eyes locked onto mine, widening in absolute paralyzing shock. The color drained completely from his face, leaving him ashen. His lips parted, but no sound came out. He stared at me. He stared at the tailored suit, the styled hair, the cold, unyielding posture, as if I were a mirage that would vanish if he blinked. The Pierce lawyers stopped shuffling their papers, looking back and forth between their paralyzed CEO and me in mounting confusion. "Julian," Nathaniel whispered. The word barely scraped out of his throat, raw and fractured. He took a stumbling step forward, his hand reaching out instinctively across the table. "Julian, my God, is it really you?" I didn't move. I didn't flinch. I let my gaze sweep over him with the detached clinical calculation of a predator evaluating its prey. "It is Mr. Vance in this room, Mr. Pierce," I said, my tone dipping into a freezing professional register. "And unless your legal team intends to conduct this multi-billion-dollar negotiation while standing, I suggest you take a seat." Nathaniel looked as though I had driven a blade straight through his ribs. His hand dropped back to his side, trembling slightly. The pain radiating from him was palpable, a suffocating wave of grief relief and sheer disbelief. He couldn't take his eyes off me. He looked at me with a desperate, starving hunger, taking in every detail, every change. You're the CEO." He breathed out, the pieces finally snapping together in his mind. "Vance Digital, it's you." "I am," I confirmed smoothly, opening the glowing tablet in front of me. "Now I have reviewed your preliminary acquisition proposal, Nathaniel, and frankly, your valuation of Pierce Enterprises is entirely delusional." I looked up, meeting his haunted eyes with a razor-sharp smile. "You're here to beg for a lifeline to save your dying legacy. I'm here to decide if you are worth saving. Shall we begin?" Nathaniel slowly sank into the leather chair opposite me. He didn't look at his lawyers. He didn't look at his financial projections. He just kept his eyes locked on mine, captivated and completely, entirely at my mercy. The game had officially changed, and this time I was the one making the rules. The heavy oak doors of the boardroom didn't just open, they were shoved wide. The suffocating scent of Chanel No. 5 and old money flooded the room before she even stepped inside. Eleanor Pierce had arrived. She walked in, flanking her son's legal team, her chin tipped up in that familiar aristocratic angle of absolute superiority. She wore a pristine white suit, looking exactly as she had 4 years ago, the untouchable matriarch of Manhattan. Then her eyes landed on me. She stopped dead in her tracks. Her perfectly manicured hand gripped the edge of a leather chair so hard her knuckles turned white. For 3 agonizing seconds, the silence in the room was absolute. I saw the gears turning behind her icy blue eyes. Confusion, disbelief, and finally a burning venomous outrage. "You," she hissed the word, slipping out like a curse. "What is the meaning of this, Nathaniel? Why is this creature sitting in the CEO's chair?" "Mother, enough." Nathaniel's voice was low-laced with a dangerous warning. He didn't look at her. His storm gray eyes remained locked entirely on me. "Take a seat, Mrs. Pierce." I said, my voice smooth and utterly devoid of emotion. "I suggest we skip the dramatic reunions. You came to Los Angeles because your empire is bleeding to death and you need a tourniquet. So let's look at the wound." I didn't wait for her to sit. I tapped the screen of my tablet. The glass walls of the boardroom automatically darkened. The 80-inch OLED screen behind me flared to life, casting a cold blue light over the horrified faces of the Pierce legal team. Pierce Enterprises. I began pacing slowly at the head of the table. A legacy media conglomerate built on a century of prestige. But prestige, unfortunately, does not pay out dividends in the digital age. Your current demographic is aging out. Rapidly. I swiped the tablet. A massive plunging red graph appeared on the screen. Your flagship networks have lost 42% of their viewership in the last 18 months. You completely missed the Gen Z and Alpha transition. But let's talk about the numbers that actually matter. Let's talk about your RPM revenue per Mila. I zoomed in on the data. Your average RPM across all digital platforms sits at a pathetic $1.12. You are paying more in server maintenance than you are making in ad revenue. Your engagement retention rate is less than 6 seconds. Your company isn't just failing, Mrs. Pierce. It is completely irrevocably obsolete. Eleanor's face flushed a violent shade of crimson. She slammed her hand onto the table, her composure shattering. "How dare you!" She shrieked, her aristocratic mask crumbling into sheer desperation. "You arrogant little nobody. We built the media landscape of this country. We have a century of heritage of brand loyalty. You think you can buy us out with a few flashy algorithms and viral apps? You are nothing but an opportunistic parasite." Heritage. I stopped pacing. I leaned over the table, planting my hands flat on the obsidian surface, staring her dead in the eye. I tapped the screen one final time. A new graph appeared, towering in bright, undeniable green. "This is Vance Digital," I said softly, my voice slicing through her hysteria like a scalpel. "Our average RPM is $28.50. We control 65% of the youth market share. We dictate the trends, the news, and the consumer habits of the next 3 generations. You have heritage, Mrs. Pierce. I have the future. You are sitting in my building, drinking my water, begging for my money. So do not mistake my charity for a negotiation." Eleanor turned to Nathaniel, trembling with rage. "Nathaniel, are you going to let him speak to me this way? Shut this down. We are leaving. We will not surrender our legacy to a vengeful lower-class person like him." "He's right." The words cut through the room like a gunshot. Eleanor froze. The lawyers held their breath. I blinked, my mask slipping for a fraction of a second as I looked at Nathaniel. Nathaniel hadn't even glanced at the screen. He was looking at me. His expression wasn't angry or humiliated or defensive. He looked utterly mesmerized. It was the look of a man staring at a solar eclipse, blinded, awestruck, and completely helpless. "The projections are perfectly accurate, Mother," Nathaniel said quietly, his voice vibrating with a strange, dark reverence. "Our model is dead. Julian's data is flawless. His infrastructure is brilliant." He finally turned his head, leveling a cold, authoritative glare at his mother. "If you cannot maintain your professionalism in Mr. Vance's boardroom, you can wait in the jet. I am running this acquisition." Eleanor looked as if she had been slapped across the face. Her own son, the heir she had molded and controlled, had just publicly severed her authority to stand beside the Omega she despised. "You are making the biggest mistake of your life, Nathaniel," she spat out, her voice shaking. She snatched her designer bag, glaring at me with pure, unfiltered hatred. "This isn't over." She stormed out of the room, the heavy doors slamming shut behind her. The silence that followed was deafening. I gestured sharply to the Pierce legal team. "Give us the room, now." They practically scrambled over each other to exit, leaving just the 2 of us. The sudden isolation was suffocating. Without the audience, the corporate armor felt infinitely heavier. Nathaniel slowly stood up. He walked around the massive table, his eyes never leaving mine. He stopped just 3 feet away, close enough that I could smell his cologne cedarwood and rain a scent that violently dragged up memories of tangled sheets and midnight whispers. "Gee, Julian," he breathed out. The corporate titan was gone. Only a desperate, starving man remained. "God, you are breathtaking. I watched you up there, commanding the room, dismantling everything my family built, and all I could think was you're magnificent." My heart hammered against my ribs, a treacherous, rhythmic betrayal. I locked my jaw, forcing the ice back into my veins. "Save the flattery for your shareholders, Nathaniel," I said coldly. I picked up the thick black folder containing the acquisition contract and slid it across the table. It stopped right at his fingertips. "This contract strips Pierce Enterprises of its voting rights. Vance Digital swallows your assets whole. You get a board seat in name only." I stated, my voice completely flat. Nathaniel didn't look at the contract. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a raw, pleading whisper. "Julian, please. I don't care about the company. I don't care about the money. Just give me 5 minutes. Off the record, please. Tell me where you went. Tell me why you vanished into thin air." I looked at him, my expression a perfect, impenetrable wall of glass. "My time costs $20,000 a minute, Mr. Pierce," I said, pointing a manicured finger at the dotted line. "Sign the paper or get out of my city." Hell hath no fury like a Manhattan matriarch humiliated in Los Angeles. It took exactly 48 hours for Eleanor Pierce to launch her retaliation. By Wednesday morning, the financial news networks were flooded with anonymous leaks, smear pieces targeting Vance Digital's data ethics, fabricated rumors of impending SEC investigations, and vicious hit pieces on my personal character, calling me a ruthless, opportunistic shadow broker. I sat in the study of my Bel Air estate, nursing a glass of bourbon, watching the stock tickers fluctuate on my multi-monitor setup. Eleanor was using the last of her family's liquid capital to wage a scorched earth PR war against me. It was pathetic, really. A dying dinosaur thrashing in the tar pit. I was already deploying counter-algorithms to bury her fake news, but the sheer volume of the attack was an annoyance. The grandfather clock in the hallway struck 9. The house was quiet save for the faint sound of cartoons playing in the living room, where the twins were supposedly winding down for bed. Suddenly, my phone buzzed. A frantic text from the front gate security appeared. It said, "Mr. Vance, a Mr. Pierce, forced his way past the outer perimeter. He threatened to ram the gates if we didn't let him walk up the driveway. Intercepting now." My blood ran cold. Stand down. Let him in. I barked into the intercom, my heart slamming against my ribs. I didn't want a violent altercation on my front lawn, not with my children inside. I stormed out of the study, marching down the long illuminated corridor toward the foyer to intercept Nathaniel before he could set foot in my house. But I was 10 seconds too late. The heavy mahogany front door was already ajar. Nathaniel stood in the center of my sunken living room. He was drenched in sweat, his tie discarded, breathing heavily as if he had sprinted the entire mile up the hill. He had clearly come to warn me, or perhaps to apologize for his mother's thermonuclear meltdown. But Nathaniel wasn't looking at me. He was standing completely frozen, staring down at the massive custom-made velvet sofa. There, occupying the center of the cushions like two tiny, terrifying emperors, were Leo and Hudson. They had heard the door open and paused their movie. 4 years old, dressed in matching silk pajamas and possessing a terrifying combination of my intellect and the Pierce family's inherent terrifying arrogance. I stopped dead in my tracks, the air completely vanishing from my lungs. Nathaniel looked like he had been struck by lightning. His eyes darted wildly from Leo's dark hair to Hudson's platinum blonde curls and finally rested on their eyes. Storm gray eyes. His eyes, staring right back at him with absolute unnerving calculation. The silence was deafening. I couldn't move. I was paralyzed by the collision of my two heavily guarded worlds. Leo was the first to speak. He didn't look scared. He looked annoyed. He tapped the screen of his tablet, adjusting his tiny glasses, and looked up at the towering billionaire. "Your net worth has decreased by 4.2% in the last 3 hours," Leo stated, his high-pitched voice dripping with clinical precision. "And your company's stock is currently trading at a 10-year low. That is highly inefficient. Are you lost, or just bad at math?" Nathaniel let out a choked, breathless sound. He dropped to his knees right there on the Persian rug, ignoring his ruined suit, bringing himself down to their eye level. His hands were shaking so violently he had to grip his own thighs to stop them. Nathaniel whispered, tears instantly flooding his eyes. You have my eyes." Hudson, who had inherited his father's dominant alpha aura and his grandmother's aristocratic entitlement, stood up on the sofa cushions. He crossed his tiny arms over his chest, looking down at the weeping billionaire with absolute disdain. "If you want to sit on our sofa, you have to pay the toll," Hudson demanded, pointing a chubby finger toward the kitchen. "Go make my milk. Warm, not hot. 2 scoops of formula. If you burn it, I will have you fired." A wet, broken laugh tore its way out of Nathaniel's throat. A billionaire corporate raider currently being ordered around by a 4-year-old in pajamas. The tears spilled over his eyelashes, tracking down his cheeks. He reached out a trembling hand, desperately wanting to touch Hudson's cheek, wanting to feel the reality of the sons he never knew he had. "Don't touch them." My voice cracked through the room like a whip. Nathaniel flinched, his hand freezing midair. He looked up at me, his face completely wrecked, entirely stripped of any corporate armor. I walked down the steps into the living room, my vision blurring with a fierce, blinding panic. All the trauma, all the terror of that rainy night in Manhattan came rushing back, suffocating me. I stepped between Nathaniel and the sofa, shielding my children with my own body. "Julian," Nathaniel pleaded, his voice cracking. He stayed on his knees, looking up at me like a beggar praying to a merciless God. "Please, are they mine? Please tell me." "They are mine," I hissed, my voice trembling with a rage so pure it burned my throat. "They are the liabilities you wanted to clean up. Remember, they are the stain on your pristine legacy. You made your choice 4 years ago, Nathaniel. You don't get to walk in here and play father." "I didn't know." He sobbed, the sound tearing from deep within his chest. "Julian, I swear to God, I didn't know you were pregnant. If I had known." "If you had known what?" I interrupted, my voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "You would have trapped me, forced me to endure your mother's hatred just so you could have heirs. Get out." "Julian, please, my mother is trying to destroy you. I came to tell you I'm stopping her. I'll do anything. Just let me look at them, just for 1 more minute." I said, "Get out." I screamed, the corporate mask completely shattering. "Security is on their way. If you ever come near my sons again, I will not just bankrupt Pierce Enterprises. I will erase your name from the earth. Get out of my house." Nathaniel looked at me, seeing the absolute terror and pain radiating from every inch of my body. He realized in that agonizing moment the sheer magnitude of the destruction his family had caused. He didn't fight back. He slowly stood up, wiping his face. He looked over my shoulder, catching one last desperate glimpse of Leo and Hudson, who were watching the scene with wide, quiet eyes. "I'm sorry," Nathaniel whispered to the room. He turned around and walked out the front door, stepping into the cool Los Angeles night. I collapsed onto the edge of the sofa, pulling both Leo and Hudson into my arms, burying my face in their hair, shaking uncontrollably. I had protected them. I had won. But outside, as the heavy gates closed, I didn't know that Nathaniel Pierce had pulled out his phone. I didn't know that as he stood at the end of my driveway, he wasn't calling a car. He was calling his private legal counsel. "Draw up the papers," Nathaniel commanded into the phone, his voice suddenly stripped of all tears, replaced by a dark, terrifying resolve. "I am divesting my entire stake in Pierce Enterprises. I'm going to burn my mother's empire to the ground." I watched a man burn his own empire to the ground on live television. It was 3 o'clock in the afternoon when Nathaniel Pierce called an emergency press conference at the Manhattan headquarters. I sat in my Los Angeles office, the live feed projected onto my wall monitor. I had expected a defensive PR spin. I had expected a classic Pierce maneuver, deny, deflect, and destroy. Instead, Nathaniel walked up to the podium, leaned into the microphones, and dropped a nuclear bomb on his own legacy. The recent smear campaigns directed at Vance Digital were orchestrated entirely by Eleanor Pierce and funded by Pierce Enterprises. Nathaniel's voice echoed through the speakers, cold, steady, and utterly ruthless. "I have provided the SEC and the leading journalistic outlets with the IP logs, the financial transfers, and the corresponding emails to prove it." The press room erupted into absolute chaos. Camera flashes strobed like lightning. Nathaniel didn't flinch. He looked directly into the central camera lens, his storm gray eyes burning with a dark, terrifying resolve. Furthermore, he continued raising his voice over the shouting reporters. "I no longer stand with this corporation or its archaic, toxic values. Effective immediately, I am resigning as CEO of Pierce Enterprises. I am divesting my shares, relinquishing my board seat, and entirely severing my ties with the Pierce family." He stepped away from the podium and walked out. I sat frozen in my leather chair, my breath caught in my throat. He had done it. He had actually done it. He had publicly slaughtered his mother's reputation, dismantled his own birthright, and walked away with nothing. Within 2 hours, the news networks confirmed the fallout. Eleanor Pierce, in a fit of apocalyptic rage, had officially disinherited him. His trust funds were liquidated. His corporate accounts were frozen. Nathaniel Pierce, the Prince of Manhattan, was effectively ruined. By 11 o'clock that night, a rare, violent thunderstorm had rolled into Los Angeles. The rain lashed against the windows of my Bel Air estate, a haunting echo of the night I had fled New York 4 years ago. My phone buzzed. It was the gate security. The guard told me that he was back. He didn't have a car. He had just walked up the hill in the rain. He was standing at the gate. My chest tightened. Let him through. I didn't wait for him to knock. I pulled open the heavy mahogany front door. Nathaniel stood on my porch. He looked like a ghost. He wasn't wearing a bespoke suit anymore. He just wore a soaked plain gray sweater and dark jeans that clung heavily to his shivering frame. His hair was plastered to his forehead, and water dripped steadily from his jawline. He had no umbrella, no security detail, no black SUV waiting in the driveway. He was completely, devastatingly alone. He didn't try to step inside. He just reached into his wet pocket with a trembling hand and pulled out a small silver USB drive. He held it out to me. "I didn't come to beg," Nathaniel said. His voice was hoarse, barely audible over the pouring rain. "I have no right to ask for your forgiveness, and I have no right to ask for my son's. But you need to know the truth. That is the only thing I have left to give you." I stared at the silver drive, then up at his wrecked, exhausted face. Slowly, I reached out and took it. Our fingers brushed. His skin was freezing. "Wait here," I commanded, my voice surprisingly unsteady. I left him on the porch and walked into my study, plugging the drive into my encrypted laptop. A single folder popped up. It was entirely composed of heavily secured emails, legal documents, and wire transfers dating back exactly 4 years ago. I opened the first file. It was an email from Nathaniel to a private wealth management firm. The subject was asset liquidation and relocation. The message instructed them to begin the transfer of his personal assets to the offshore accounts. He wanted them to purchase the property in New Zealand under Julian's name. He stated that he needed the exit strategy finalized by Friday. My heart skipped a beat. I opened the next file. It was an invoice from a master jeweler in Paris, a custom engagement ring. The engraving instructions read, "For Julian, my sanctuary." I kept clicking, my vision blurring as I read through the desperate, frantic legal maneuvers of a man trying to sever himself from a billion-dollar empire. The dates aligned perfectly. It was all happening in the weeks leading up to that fateful shareholder meeting. And then there was a final audio file, a voice memo Nathaniel had recorded for himself on the very night I ran away. I pressed play. I told Father we needed to clean him up like a liability. Nathaniel's recorded voice sounded exhausted, broken. I had to use their language. I had to make them think I was tossing Julian aside just to buy me enough time to get the offshore accounts cleared. Tomorrow I'll give him the ring, and we will leave this suffocating hellhole forever. I just pray he forgives me for keeping him in the dark. The audio cut out. I sat in the glow of the monitors, a profound, shattering silence ringing in my ears. He hadn't betrayed me. He had never viewed me as a liability. He had been tearing down his own life brick by brick, trying to build a fortress for us. The cold, ruthless phone call I had overheard was nothing but a desperate smokescreen to protect me from his family's wrath while he finalized our escape. And because he was too proud or too foolish to tell me his plan, I had shattered both of our lives. A heavy, aching sob tore its way out of my throat. The impenetrable walls of ice I had spent 4 years building around my heart cracked, splintering into a million pieces. I stood up, nearly knocking my chair over, and ran back to the foyer. Nathaniel was still standing exactly where I had left him on the porch. The storm was raging behind him. He looked at me, seeing the tears streaming down my face, and he offered a small, tragic, resigned smile. "I'm sorry I was a coward, Julian." He whispered into the rain. "I should have told you. I love you. I have never stopped. Goodbye." He turned around, pulling his wet collar up against the biting wind, preparing to walk back down the long, dark driveway into nothingness. "Nathaniel." He froze. I gripped the edge of the heavy door, my knuckles white, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I wasn't ready to forgive everything. I wasn't ready to instantly rebuild what had been broken, but I was looking at a man who had bled himself dry for me. "Hudson said the toll for the sofa is warm milk," I said, my voice trembling but clear. "But tonight, a dry towel will have to do." Nathaniel slowly turned back around. The sheer, overwhelming disbelief on his face was blinding. I stepped back, opening the door wider, letting the warm light of the hallway spill out onto the porch. "Come inside out of the rain, you idiot," I whispered. For the first time in 4 years, Nathaniel Pierce stepped across my threshold. He didn't come as a billionaire or an heir or an enemy. He just came home. The spectacular fall of Nathaniel Pierce was the headline of the financial decade, but his resurrection was a private, closely guarded spectacle occurring daily on the top floor of Vance Digital. I hired him as an unpaid intern. It started as a petty, vindictive joke, but Nathaniel accepted the contract with a terrifying, earnest enthusiasm. The former titan of Wall Street, a man who used to command boardrooms with a single glance, was now tasked with fetching my oat milk lattes and organizing my digital calendar. He traded his bespoke Tom Ford suits for simple slacks and rolled up button-downs. Yet somehow he had never looked more devastatingly handsome. But my demands were nothing compared to the absolute tyrannical reign of his sons. It was a Tuesday afternoon. I stood by the glass door of the employee break room, holding my breath to keep from laughing out loud. Nathaniel was sitting on the floor. Hudson was sitting on Nathaniel's back, treating his father like a heavily breathing, poorly trained pony, gripping Nathaniel's collar and shouting, "Mush! The cavalry needs to reach the kitchen." Beside them, Leo stood with a clipboard. It was my actual literal clipboard. "Your pacing is inconsistent, Nathaniel Sayu," Leo stated, pushing his tiny glasses up the bridge of his nose. "And the Lego set you purchased with your weekend barista wages lacks structural integrity. The return on investment is abysmal. You are receiving a negative performance review for Q3. Nathaniel, sweating broke and currently serving as human transport, looked up at Leo with absolute overflowing adoration. "I apologize, sir." Nathaniel gasped out, smiling so widely it looked like his face might break. "I will strive to optimize my block building strategies and improve my galloping metrics." I leaned against the door frame, crossing my arms, my heart swelling with a chaotic mixture of disbelief and an overwhelming, terrifying warmth. The walls I had built around myself were gone, burned down not by grand gestures of wealth, but by a man willing to strip himself of all his armor just to exist in our orbit. In turn, I called out sharply, though the corner of my mouth betrayed me. "Get off the floor. We have the Media Visionary Gala tonight. You are carrying my coat." Nathaniel dumped Hudson gently onto the plush rug, much to the tiny Emperor's outrage, and scrambled to his feet. "Yes, Mr. Vance, right away!" The Los Angeles Media Visionary Gala was the crown jewel of the digital tech season. The red carpet was a blinding storm of camera flashes and screaming reporters. I walked down the center line, flanked by security, wearing a midnight blue velvet tuxedo. Nathaniel walked exactly one step behind me, carrying my overcoat, his head bowed in a posture of perfect, respectful submission. But the ghosts of Manhattan have a way of haunting you, no matter how far west you run. As we entered the VIP ballroom, a cluster of older, distinctly East Coast executives intercepted us. At the center was Richard Sterling, a lifelong board member of Pierce Enterprises and Eleanor's most venomous loyalist. Richard looked me up and down with barely concealed disgust, but his real target was the man standing behind me, Nathaniel. Richard sneered, his voice loud enough to draw the attention of the surrounding tech moguls and journalists. "Look at you, holding a coat for an Omega. Eleanor wept when she saw the headlines, you know. The heir to a century-old dynasty reduced to a glorified servant. It's pathetic. Have you no dignity left? Come back to New York. Apologize to your mother before you humiliate the Pierce name any further." The ballroom went dead silent. Phones were subtly raised. The industry sharks were waiting for blood. I stiffened my protective instincts, instantly flaring. I opened my mouth to verbally dissect Richard Sterling, but a heavy, warm hand gently placed itself on my shoulder. Nathaniel stepped past me. He didn't look humiliated. He didn't look broken. He looked at Richard with a calm, pitying serenity that was infinitely more terrifying than his old corporate wrath. "The Pierce name," Nathaniel said, his voice projecting effortlessly across the silent ballroom, "means absolutely nothing to me, Richard. My dignity wasn't lost when I started holding Julian's coat. My dignity was lost 4 years ago when I let my family's archaic, toxic pride blind me to the only real thing I ever had." Nathaniel turned slightly, his eyes finding mine under the chandeliers. The intensity in his gaze stripped the breath from my lungs. "Julian Vance built an empire from the ashes my family left him in." Nathaniel continued, his voice ringing with absolute, unshakable pride. "His success is entirely his own. I claim zero credit. In fact, for the record, I am currently an unpaid intern and a complete freeloader desperately attempting to court the chairman of Vance Digital." A collective gasp, followed by scattered, shocked laughter, rippled through the crowd. Nathaniel looked back at Richard. "So tell my mother to save her tears, because standing behind Julian Vance is the greatest honor of my life. Now step aside. My boss needs a drink." Richard's face flushed an ugly mottled purple. He sputtered, but the crowd of young tech billionaires was already parting for us, murmuring in absolute awe. 2 hours later, the chaos of the gala was behind us. We were back in the quiet sanctuary of my executive office. The twins were fast asleep on the massive sofa, tangled together under a cashmere blanket. Nathaniel was sitting on the edge of the coffee table, watching them sleep with that same starving reverence he had carried since the day he found us. I walked behind my desk and opened the top drawer. "You caused quite a scene tonight, intern," I said softly. Nathaniel looked up, a self-deprecating smile touching his lips. "I apologize if I overstepped Julian, but I couldn't let him speak to you like that. Not ever again." I pulled out a crisp white document. It was the ridiculous, legally binding internship agreement I had forced him to sign a month ago. I picked up a gold fountain pen, crossed out the words internship agreement at the top, and in sharp, clear letters wrote marriage certificate. I walked around the desk and slid the paper onto the coffee table right next to his hands. Nathaniel looked down at it. His breath hitched. He froze, completely paralyzed, staring at the crossed out words. Slowly, his trembling eyes moved up to meet mine. "Your probation period is over, Nathaniel." I whispered, the last remaining shard of ice in my soul melting away. "You're hired. For life, if you want the position." Nathaniel didn't say a word. He stood up, closing the distance between us in a single desperate stride. He pulled me into his arms, burying his face in the crook of my neck. He was crying, his broad shoulders shaking with the force of 1,000 broken pieces finally fitting back together. I wrapped my arms around him, holding him just as tightly, breathing in the scent of cedarwood and rain. The storm was finally over. We were going home. It was strange being back in New York. 4 years ago, this city had felt like a towering glass and steel prison. It was a cold, unforgiving monolith that worshipped old money and devoured anything soft or vulnerable. But today, under the brilliant sun-drenched canopy of Central Park, Manhattan, didn't feel like a cage anymore. It felt remarkably like a playground. The Manhattan skyline loomed in the distance, cutting a sharp silhouette against the bright blue sky. Somewhere in that concrete jungle, the final remnants of Pierce Enterprises were being legally absorbed into the Vance digital ecosystem. The acquisition was complete. I was officially the undisputed king of East Coast media. But my crown was currently sitting on my lap, taking the form of a half-filled leather-bound sketchbook. I sat on a wrought iron park bench, the dappled sunlight warming my shoulders. For the first time in nearly half a decade, I wasn't looking at spreadsheets, RPM metrics, or demographic algorithms. I was holding a charcoal pencil, sketching the chaotic, spectacular scene unfolding on the great lawn right in front of me. Faster, peasant, the cavalry is losing ground. That was Hudson. He was currently standing on top of a large granite boulder, wielding a perfectly straight twig, like an aristocratic broadsword. Below him, the former master of the universe, a man who once commanded global markets with a single text message, was entirely out of breath. Nathaniel Pierce was wearing a pair of casual denim jeans and a fitted white Henley that was currently stained with grass at the knees. He was jogging in exaggerated clumsy circles around the boulder, carrying a backpack entirely stuffed with juice boxes and organic fruit snacks. I am galloping at maximum capacity, Your Highness, Nathaniel panted, clutching his chest in mock agony, though his face was split by a blinding, painfully genuine smile. The royal steed requires a hydration break. Denied, Hudson declared without an ounce of mercy. Gallop. 10 yards away from this tyrannical display, Leo was engaged in his own unique form of recreation. He was sitting cross-legged on the grass, wearing his tiny designer glasses, holding a handful of breadcrumbs. He was not throwing them. He was apparently conducting a performance review of the local wildlife. Your foraging strategy is highly inefficient, Leo informed a very confused pigeon that was bobbing its head a few inches away. You are relying entirely on the unpredictable generosity of tourists. If you strategically repositioned yourself near the hot dog vendor's primary waste receptacle, your daily caloric yield would increase by at least 400%. Do you even understand market placement? The pigeon cooed and pecked blindly at the dirt. Leo sighed heavily, pinching the bridge of his nose in a gesture that looked terrifyingly like my own. Incompetent. I let out a soft, involuntary laugh, the sound carrying on the warm autumn breeze. I looked down at my sketchbook. The charcoal lines captured the exact curve of Nathaniel's exhausted, radiant smile and the absolute imperious posture of our sons. I was drawing again. I traced the edge of the paper with my thumb. 4 years ago, I had fled the city in the dead of night, convinced I was a worthless omega, a liability meant to be swept under the rug and forgotten. I had built a digital empire out of sheer spite. I had forged myself into a weapon of data capital and algorithms because I thought power was the only thing that could keep me safe from the cruelty of the world. I thought ruling an empire was the ultimate victory. But as I watched Nathaniel suddenly lunge forward, scooping a shrieking, laughing Hudson off the boulder and spinning him in the air, I realized how wrong I had been. True power wasn't a bank account. It wasn't the ability to crush your enemies on a boardroom table or manipulate global trends. True power was having the absolute undeniable freedom to be soft. It was the ability to sit on a park bench, completely unbothered, drawing a children's book, while the man who burned down his own universe just to live in yours played with your children. You're smiling. I looked up. Nathaniel was jogging over to my bench, leaving the twins briefly occupied with a passing golden retriever. He practically collapsed onto the empty space beside me, chest heaving, his hair messy and damp with sweat. He smelled like crushed grass, expensive cedarwood cologne, and sunshine. He leaned over, resting his chin on my shoulder to look at the sketchbook in my lap. That's beautiful, Julian," he murmured, his voice dropping into that deep, intimate register that still made my pulse skip a beat. "You haven't drawn in years." I thought you said the CEO of Vance Digital didn't have time for fairy tales. I don't, I replied smoothly, closing the sketchbook and turning to look at him. But I recently hired a very eager, albeit slightly clumsy intern to handle the day-to-day corporate operations. It freed up my schedule. Nathaniel let out a low, rumbling laugh. He reached up his large, calloused hand, gently cupping my jaw. His thumb brushed affectionately across my cheekbone. The haunted, starving look that had clouded his storm-gray eyes for years was completely gone. In its place was a quiet, unshakable peace. "I love you," Nathaniel whispered the words, carrying the weight of a vow. More than the empire, more than the legacy, more than anything. I leaned into his touch, letting my eyes flutter shut for a fraction of a second, absorbing the absolute safety of his presence. "I know," I said softly. I opened my eyes, offering him a small, rare smile that belonged entirely, exclusively to him. "Now, go back to work, intern. I believe the Royal Pigeon Advisor requires a juice box." Nathaniel grinned, leaning in to press a lingering, sun-warmed kiss against my temple before pushing himself off the bench. "Right away, Mr. Vance." I watched him run back across the grass, scooped instantly into a tackle by both Leo and Hudson. The sound of their laughter echoed through the trees, bright and unbroken. I opened my sketchbook again, picking up my pencil. The shadows of the past were finally gone. The storm was over. We had built our own kingdom from the ashes, and looking at the three of them bathed in the golden Manhattan light, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. We were exactly where we were meant to be.